Hey guys, this is Ben, and I've got an interesting video for you today, and it's simply going to be on the subject of how to win at chess. I've got one example game we're going to go through, one that I played this morning, and we're going to go into some detail about the difference between what I do in the game and what my opponent does in the game. Okay. Now my opponent was rated a couple of 100 points below me, so I'm about 1440. They were about 1240. But I think that this game really does embody a lot of the principles and the ideas. So let's just jump in, right? Follow me through this game. I'm going to give as much detail as I can on why, this is the important thing, why a particular move is good or weak. Okay, so let's start. So I'm playing with the white pieces and I start with e4. My opponent replies with e5, all very standard. I play knight f3 and then he plays the Philidor, which is with d6. This is a pretty quiet opening. It is valid, but to me, it seems like he's already playing a bit slow and not entirely dynamic enough, I guess. So one of the obvious things is that he's blocked off this diagonal for his dark squared bishop. So his dark squared bishop is going to struggle. If these pawns remain on dark squares, even if he fianchettos his bishop there onto g7, the bishop's still going to be staring at one of his own pawns. So to me, this is not a very active way to play. So we've had two moves, he's moved two pawns, no pieces yet developed. Okay, so I develop my light square bishop. All things being equal, in the opening, it makes sense to get out your king's knight and your king's bishop. Why? Because getting your king to safety, which normally means castling, is one of the main things that you should be doing in the opening, right, to complete development. So you want to get your king to safety, you want to have control of the center, and you want to develop your minor pieces. Okay, so far in three moves, I've moved one pawn, which is necessary to get out one bishop. I've moved my knight, I've moved my bishop. Okay, so now I'm actually ready to castle. Only after move 3. My opponent is nowhere near castling. It's going to take him 3 more moves to get to that point. Okay, so he spots the threat. The obvious threat is knight comes into g5, and then either knight takes f7 or bishop takes f7 with check, forcing the king to move. Okay, so this is a prophylactic move, h6, but it is a third pawn move. He's made 3 pawn moves in succession. So he has none of his pieces out in the board. He's only been developing pawns. And let's look at the board now. Okay, so I'm going to highlight all the squares in the main area of the board that my pieces are controlling. Okay, so we've got my knight is now looking at the full complement of 8 squares. Okay, and my bishop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more squares, right? So and the pawn is also there guarding f5. So that's like 19 squares that my pieces are controlling. Okay, now let's look at what my opponent's controlling with his pieces. Okay, he's got his knight there. I mean, I've also got my knight at home there. This is it. this is all he's got. Okay, his queen's looking at that, and his bishop's got there. So I had 19. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Okay, he's only controlling 12 squares on the board. I'm controlling 19. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are more squares that my pieces can move safely and occupy. It means that there are fewer squares that his pieces can move to safely. So already, after 3 moves, my opponent's options are reduced. Okay, so it's like an arm wrestle. I have now just slightly got the upper hand because I'm controlling more squares on the board. You know, I've got a nice central pawn, but more importantly, I've got some minor pieces out into the game. Okay, so he's played h6. I then play d4. Okay, so I'm playing actively, I'm playing aggressively, right? And putting the question to my opponent. Now, even now, maybe he should be thinking about still developing pieces. But what happens is he accepts the pawn trade. Now, I don't immediately take back. Why don't I take back? Well, I want to get my king to safety, okay? And I want to create opportunities to put pressure on my opponent. Plus, that pawn there on d4 is now, it's not got a very long future in this game. He's got doubled pawns now on the d file, right? It's going to be hard for him to protect and defend all of those pawns. I also now have a semi-open file, right, with only my pawn on it, and his king, of course, is not yet castled, right? So I believe I have the upper hand at this point in the game. Black's now moved his queen to e7, so clearly he's worried about maybe rook to e1, and then this pawn comes up the board trying to attack the king. But again, just look at this. All of his knights, all of his bishops, all of his rooks are still in the starting blocks. Okay, so my next move, c3. This is a move that I've started playing a bit more recently. I play it against the Sicilian, and it's again, it's dynamic and it's exciting. So this is allowing my queen more space. So although my queen doesn't really have much to go, I mean, an alternative could have been I just could have captured on there. But I'm thinking, how can we be as aggressive as possible? I want to cause my opponent problems. I want to come up with ways to create moves that force him to react. Okay, so that I have got the upper hand in the fight. Okay, it's like getting your opponent on the ground in wrestling or martial arts. You want your opponent to be so busy defending against your blows that they really haven't got time to come up with an attack themselves. Black decides to capture on c3. That's not a big issue for me, and I recapture with a knight. I don't want to split up my pawns on a2 and b2. If I recapture with the b2 pawn, that would create an isolated pawn on a and an isolated pawn there on c3. I don't want to do that, and of course this is an opportunity for me to develop another piece. Okay, I now have 3 minor pieces developed into the board, and my dark squared bishop will follow soon as well. Black has none, and we're going to see how this imbalance, right, the black's slowness in development, we're going to see how that costs him as the game develops. Okay, so now finally, move 7, he's developed his first piece, minor piece into the board. Okay, bishop comes out to g4, quite common move, pinning my knight against the queen, so my knight can't move or my queen will drop, and I don't want to move my queen. My queen is also currently the only defender of that knight. Okay, so if I were to move my queen somewhere, and then bishop takes knight, the only piece that can recapture is my g pawn, and that would leave my king very vulnerable on a semi-open file with, again, isolated pawns. I don't want that to happen. I really don't want to see that. So, as very often, I mean, this is not something I have to respond to immediately as well. That's another really key thing. Something that you see beginners do a lot is, there's a threat, and they immediately think, oh, there's a threat, I've got to respond to the threat, I've got to do something, I've got to capture, I've got to exchange, whatever, I've got to take back. You don't always have to do that, okay? In this case, my queen is defending the knight, okay? As long as I remember, don't move your knight and don't move your queen unless you've got some other way to defend the knight, then that's okay, There is nothing wrong with this situation. I don't have to resolve the tension. That's the way that expert teachers will describe it. You create tension in the game, and I think it's an important skill to be able to look at that and go, okay, there's tension there. That's fine, but I can handle it. It's under control right now. So what I'm choosing to do is go on the attack instead of immediately kind of come back into my shell and start to defend. Okay, so I move my knight out to d5. And what's this doing? It's hitting black's queen on e7. It's also looking at c7 and that very tasty fork. If you can ever capture there with a knight, then it would be forking the king and the rook. So that would come with check, and you'd basically win the rook. Okay, so black does have to respond again. Okay, so I've come in with an attack. Black has to do something about it. Also notice that my pawn on e4 is hanging. There is no piece defending that pawn. That is quite deliberate. Okay, that is a trap. It's a poisoned pawn. Okay, because if black's queen comes in and captures that pawn, rook to e1 wins the queen. Black has no way to. It can't move the queen out of the way because the queen is in an absolute pin against the king. It would be an illegal move. You cannot make a move that puts yourself in check. And there's no piece that black has that could block the path from the rook to the queen, because black's got no pieces out in the board. They're all sitting, sleeping at home. Okay, so black has to respond, protecting the pawn and moving the queen. There's only two squares that he could have gone to, and there they are. So I'm getting towards the end of the opening now. I've almost developed all of my pieces. What am I thinking about? I'm thinking I want to keep the pressure on my opponent. I want to stop my opponent from castling and getting his king to safety. Right? I would like to keep him smothered so that he still can't develop the rest of his pieces. Okay, because all of that is going to keep me with more options, more play. I'll have a much easier time coming up with attacks, etc. Okay, so I've moved my rook to e1 anyway, so it is defending the e4 pawn. Now if I start to push my e4 pawn up the board, let's say pawn takes and then rook takes with check, it's starting to look uncomfortable for black. Black makes a pawn move. Another pawn move. Right? Black has made a lot of pawn moves. This is move 9, and he's made 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn moves already. Okay. One of the things that I see beginners do an awful lot is making pawn moves too cheaply. So you think, oh, I want to get rid of that knight. I'll just push a pawn forward and get rid of it. Every time you move a pawn, you weaken something, right? And you change the structure of the game. Also remember that pawns are the only pieces on the chessboard that can't move backwards, right? So once you've pushed a pawn forwards, it's staying forwards. Pawns can only go in one direction. As you'll notice, I will very often keep my side pawns here tight and controlled as much as possible, unless I decide to do a pawn storm on one side of the board as part of my attack, which can be very powerful. Okay, so my knight's obviously under attack. I need to move it back. So one option could have been to move my knight back here to e3. That would have taken one option away from my dark squared bishop, which still hasn't developed. And also I'm thinking maybe, having this knight there rather than there keeps it more towards the middle of the board, more towards the enemy king. Again, I'm trying to crush him in, keep the pressure up. Black makes another pawn move, b5. Why? So he's hitting the bishop, but the bishop isn't threatened. I just move straight back to b3, and what's he done? He's now got these pawns here that are starting to look a bit isolated. This one's a bit far ahead. I'm not happy. I wouldn't be happy with this situation. You've really got to be careful before and think very carefully before you start shoving pawns up the board. All right. So I move my bishop back. Black develops his dark squared bishop to e7. There is a general principle in chess openings where people tend to say move your knights before your bishops. You'll notice here that Black has still not moved either of his knights, okay? But he is getting a little bit nearer to castling. All he needs to do is to bring that knight out to f6 and he'll be able to castle, okay? So what can we do about that? I decide to play h3. I don't really like this queen and bishop here on this diagonal. I think let's get the bishop out of the way. If the bishop obviously can't go to h5 because I've got a knight covering that. The bishop can't go there because it's so it can't go to h5. It can't go to f5 because of the pawn. If it goes to e6, then I've got a knight and my own light square bishop there ready to attack. So what's the bishop going to do? Okay, so at this point now he clearly blunders. He actually spent 35 seconds on that move, right? I think is this a 20-minute game? But clearly a blunder. I capture with a knight. Here's one super important tip, right? And I've probably said it before in videos, and I'm sure I'll say it lots more times in videos. This is a lesson that sometimes I still need to remind myself and still need to learn over and over again. When your opponent makes a move, one of the first things that you should ask yourself in your kind of mental checklist, what has changed on the board? Okay, with that move, what's changed? Is something now en prise, meaning it can be captured, right? And in this case, yes, my opponent has made a blunder. Always be ready and open to the possibility that your opponent has made a blunder. If you've got a kind of a mental checklist that you want to run through, one of them is, did my opponent just blunder? Okay, sounds really simplistic, but the number of games I've played where my opponent makes a move and I then just very quickly, without thinking, play the obvious move, or the move that first pops into my head, and then I'm looking at the board thinking, I could have taken his rook, I could have, forked him or whatever. Always be ready. Players at every level can make blunders. Okay, so along with that, this brings us back to the number one most important tip if you want to improve your chess, which is to slow down. So my advice is, if you need to play the kind of time controls that allow you to scan the whole board, appreciate what has changed with your opponent's last move, consider why your opponent made that move, check the entire board for, like we say, when you're thinking what's changed, what is now undefended, what is now en prise, what can be captured. Okay, all of these changes. Is there another attack? Okay, now if you haven't got time to consider all of those things before you make your move, and then start thinking about your next move, so you come up with candidate moves. Never make a move out of a selection of one, right? Always think, actually, is there something else I could do in between, right? So if you haven't got time to do all that, you are playing too fast, okay? And if you're playing too fast, then you are not going. You aren't playing your best chess, and if you're not playing your best chess, you're not going to improve, right? Play your best chess so that you can defeat the opponents that you should be defeating, so that your ranking can climb, so that you can start playing more opponents more frequently who are genuinely at a similar standard to you or better, right? That's the way to improve. If you play very fast time controls, right? If you're playing 5-minute blitz over and over and over again, if you're playing 20 games a day or whatever, then you could just be practicing playing badly. There's no benefit to you in practicing playing badly. You want to play your best chess, okay? So this guy spent 35 seconds on that move. He's still got 15 minutes on the clock. He's actually a pawn up at this point in the game. There's no reason to blunder like that, okay? So I snatched the bishop. Obviously I check the board. So let's see, 2.5 seconds. It took me to scan the board. I know that knight's safe. I know the knight can come back to g3 if it needs to. Okay, it's a clear blunder. And obviously now, my knight is attacking g7 because of that blunder. So black has to do something about that. Pushing the pawn forward wouldn't be a great idea because my knight can still go to g7, still with check, and force the king to move. Although my knight would then not have a safe square. But h7, rook h7 was played. And I now finally develop my final minor piece. This is move 14. My dark square bishop comes out to f4. So I'm kind of liking this because my bishop could drop back to g3 where it's protected by a pawn. Right there it is protected by the knight. Or it could even drop back to h2 and be a sniper, hiding there in the corner, waiting for my opponent to wander into my line of fire. I do have to think at this point, is there any danger to my knight? Because by moving my bishop to this square, I have removed one of the options for my knight, but I know still that my knight can still come back to g3. So that's okay. You have to start checking these things when you make a move. If I move my bishop there, is there a danger to my knight? Right. So he pushes g6. I'm not really impressed with this move terribly much. Again, it's another pawn move. Again, every time you move a pawn, you're creating weaknesses. Right, so that pawn was defending h6. It's now no longer defending h6. h6 is still defended by the knight and the rook. Okay, but things change. Don't push pawns up with measly attacks that can easily be avoided. So clearly my knight just jumps back to g3. And when I look at this board, it seems like very stark difference. Right. The white pieces look like they're coordinated. I'm fully developed, right? I'm castled. I've got one of my rooks in the central 2 columns, which is important. Black, on the other hand, has got 2 knights standing there with nothing to do. One of his rooks is immobile, cannot move because the knight hasn't developed, right? All of these things that started way back in the opening of the game, okay, have contributed to black's weakness at this point in the middle game, really. So black thinks it's a good idea now to develop a minor piece, and the knight comes flying out to f6. Maybe he's got ideas of bringing his king round to one of these squares where he's got some pieces around it, still got some pawns around it. You know, maybe he's thinking that's a bit of a fortress for his king. So it's a perfectly reasonable move. Now, what am I doing? I can see that my opponent is weak. My opponent has not completed development. My opponent is on the ropes. When you've got that, keep the pressure up, right? Keep pressing the bugger. So e5 comes in. I'm attacking the knight that has just entered the game. The king is there. I have a rook on e1. The king is still on e8. Okay, I would love it to see this pawn removed from the board. All right. If d takes, then our queens are facing off against each other, and I can recapture with a rook. I can recapture with the bishop. I can recapture with a knight as well. I've got lots and lots of options. Why have I got lots of options? Because my pieces are on good squares. My pieces are on squares where they can take part in the game. My opponent's pieces are not. Look how bad his pieces are. This knight here has only one square it can go to. This rook here has nowhere to go to. This rook here has 2 squares it can go to. Okay, my rook, on the other hand, my e-rook is staring down the barrel at black's king. Right? I have loads more options, and the reason I've got loads more options, I'll say it again, is because I develop my pieces quicker. Right? I played moves that achieved something while developing pieces, whereas black was far too passive, far too defensive, and just kept shoving pawns around. Okay, not a good situation. Okay, so black decides to capture on e5. Okay, so now think about this. One of my options, and we're thinking candidate moves, okay, so you want to allow yourself time to do this process. Think about, ideally, every legal move that's on the board, right? Okay. If that move is played, how is your opponent going to respond? When your opponent responds, does that leave you in a stronger position or a weaker position? Does it leave your opponent in a stronger or a weaker position? Who comes out? Who wins that exchange if you make this move? Okay. Now, one option I've got here is to exchange queens. A lot of beginners would do that. Okay. I could do queen takes queen on d7. Now, what happens if I do that? He's not going to recapture with his king. Okay, and put his king on a completely open file. He's probably, okay, so if I play that, he's probably going to recapture with his knight on b8, right? If he recaptures with his knight on b8, he has developed his final minor piece. Okay, so that's good for black, right? What's more, he opens up the back rank for his rook on a8. Okay, that's 2 benefits for black. Right? Have I benefited in any way from exchanging queens? Not really. Okay, so that is a move that would play straight into my opponent's hands. It would allow my opponent to do what he wants to do. So I'm not going to do that. So we think about other moves. Okay, now my bishop is under attack right now. So most likely thing, as we've said, I've got 3 pieces. Looking at that pawn, I need to think about probably recapturing the pawn. Now, which is the best piece to do it with? I could take with the knight. That would attack the queen, might provoke an exchange. And conversely, right, thinking about other options, not going for the queen exchange. If black does the queen exchange, okay, that benefits me. Black, queen on d7 takes queen on d1, right? I then recapture with my rook on a1, okay? And what have I done? Okay, the queens have come off the board. Doesn't make a huge amount of difference. We go into an ending, okay? But I've got my both rooks on the d file and the e file, which is where you want your rooks. Okay, at some point in the middle game, once you've developed your pieces, it's very natural to want to get your rooks into the middle of the board where... Sorry, I have to excuse the dogs. I've got a visitor turning up. Right? You want to get your rooks into the middle of the board. We very often start playing with central pawns to try and control the middle of the board. Okay, and very often there are exchanges in the middle of the board. Okay, so as opposed to here where we've got these pawns still in place in their starting blocks at the edges, right? The middle of the board is a lot more open. With semi-open files or completely open files. So here the C file is semi-open, the D file is completely open, the E file is semi-open, right? So getting your rooks into the middle of the board makes a whole heap of sense, all right? So I'm happy with the queen exchange if black initiates it, right? I don't want to initiate it myself because it weakens me and strengthens my opponent. Okay, so in the end, I decide to capture with the bishop. Now this comes with a sting in the tail because I see there is a potential tactic, right, that my bishop could then capture the knight on f6, okay, and the knight on f6 is only defended by the bishop on e7, but the bishop on e7 then would not be able to recapture because it's pinned by this rook, okay. The bishop is in front of the king, bishop cannot move if my bishop moves out of the way. So what does black do at this point? He moves his knight to d5. That's not a bad move, right? He's trying to get his remaining... He's trying to get his knights up the board, and knights are much happier when they're up the board, right? He's centralized his knight. He still hasn't developed this knight on b8, so maybe he could have had an idea of bringing his knight like that to c5, attacking my bishop. That's probably what I would have done, but he's moved his knight out, and now I decide to capture the knight because look at this. Okay, we have it's defended by two pieces. It's defended by the queen and the pawn, but I figure if pawn takes, right, then that's leaving me in a stronger position. Why? Because black did have 3 pawns here, right? This pawn has now moved to here and is now isolated. So that is no better for black. It has weakened black's position again. Okay, so I now move my queen across to b3. So my queen is now looking at these pawns that are looking a bit lost up there in the middle of the board. The same pawns are defended by black's queen, so that's okay. But also what I've done here is that I've connected my 2 rooks. Again, that is one of the standard basic principles in chess. Rooks are so much more secure and so much more powerful when they can see each other. Okay, so let's carry on with the game. Black moves his king. Can't really come up with a good reason for that, but at least it's out of the line of my rook on e1, I suppose. That's probably it. And now, again, standard principles. Very often you don't have to think too hard in chess once you know the basic principles, and this is one of the basic principles. Okay, well, there's a couple of principles going on here. Centralize your rooks, and also I've got a target here. The pawn on d5 is only defended by the queen and is now attacked by 2 of my pieces, right? So very often just simply counting attackers, counting defenders. Can I bring another attacker into this idea, right? It's simple stuff. Knight comes out, and I mean, black actually had no way to add another defender to that pawn, so the pawn is now at my mercy. I decide to capture with the rook. Okay, queen could have been an option, but if I'd recaptured with the queen, that could have prompted an exchange of queens, which I don't really need to do at this point. You know, I've got the upper hand. I want attacking chances and I want checkmating chances. Okay, plus taking with a rook is a forcing move. It forces my opponent to take evasive action, and that's something I really want to do. Okay, so the queen then moves away to b5, but look at the situation now, right? My rook is now also attacking b5 as well as my queen. So what do? Rook captures on b5. I've just won 2 pawns, right? All because I had a look at the board and I could see there was a weakness. Why was there a weakness? There was a weakness because I forced my opponent to recapture with a pawn, creating an isolated pawn, hard to defend, and that's it. Simple, simple stuff. Queen has to move again. Queen moves back to c8, and I now bring my knight in. The knight is defended by the bishop, and I'm now thinking at this point in time, exchanges will be good for me. Knight captures bishop, I recapture with a rook. Another pawn push. Why push that pawn? This rook has multiple safe squares it can go to. It is not a danger. I can even go there, right? It is not a massive danger to me to move that rook. Now, quiz. Do I have to move my rook on the next turn? On my next move? Right? Or are there alternatives? Are there other ideas? Well, I see that I can move in with my knight. Knight e6 check is going to force the king to move, and look at these 2 squares, right? My queen is looking down this nice diagonal towards black's king. So there may be opportunities here. Also notice that the bishop there on e7 is currently defended by the king and by the rook. If the king moves away from that bishop, then I may have opportunities to capture that bishop with the barrage from my 2 rooks, for example. Okay, king moves to e8. And I decide just to move my rook back to e2. Now, one of the things that I always try and think about is there a move that achieves more than one objective? Right? Clearly, my first objective here was not having my rook taken. Okay. The second objective is that my rook here, it's still in line with its partner. Okay, but this rook can still defend 4 of my pawns that are still on the second rank. So there was nowhere really attractive to move it to horizontally. So that's fine. Okay. Black finally moves his last piece. His last remaining rook decides to enter the game by moving to b8, attacking my queen. I need to move my queen. Queen to a4, check. Again, keeping up the pressure, making life difficult for my opponent, forcing my opponent to do something. Okay, what can black do now? Where can the king go? It can't go there. Can't go there because of the knight. Can't go there because of the knight. It's only got 1 safe square, right? Unless he decides to block, which he can't do. The rook can't block, just gets taken by the queen. The queen can't block, just gets taken by the queen. So this move is pretty much forced. And now, see what happens when the king has moved there. Now, this rook is no longer protecting the bishop. Okay, so I spot an opportunity. Knight to g5 check. Right, I have a fork now. I'm attacking the king. Sorry, I'm attacking the king, and I'm also attacking the rook here on h7. So black is now forced to capture the knight. The only question is he going to capture with the f pawn or the h pawn? He decides to go with the h pawn, and this means that my idea can now work. I simply capture the bishop. So let's just see what's happened with that sequence of moves, right? So I move my knight. Here's another point. Bishops are better than knights when the board is open. Okay, because they are long-range pieces, and now we are starting to look towards the end game. Okay, in the end game, if the board is clear, we haven't got gridlocks of pawns everywhere with pawn chains. So his bishop is a better piece than my knight, I would say, at this point in the game. So it suits me to lose my knight if I win his bishop. Okay, so my knight moves. His pawn moves, so he's now doubled up his pawns on the g-file. I win a stronger piece than the piece that I've just lost, and it comes with check. The king has to move. The only square it should move to is g8 to defend the rook. He forgets to do that. How long did he take over that move? 7 seconds over that move. Should have taken more. He's still got nearly 8 minutes on the clock. Okay, I now grab the rook, and black is just now in a world of pain, right? So the next, the king cannot move off of the 8th rank at this point in time, okay, because my rook is covering all of those squares. And the next move that's coming, the big threat is rook to h8 with check. King then has to move, and I win the queen, and the game's extremely over. I mean, it's very much over now. But look at this situation that we have on the board. My king castled early on in the game, and he's just sat there. You know, he's sat there doing a crossword for the entire game. He's had nothing to do. He's had no threats, really, because my early development and my active play have ensured that my opponent has spent the entire game trying to protect himself from blows. Okay, and that's it. Chess is simple things so much of the time. Do the simple things, right? Let's just quickly go back to the beginning, okay? And let's just remind ourselves of the simple things, right? Central pawn, fine, central pawn. Develop your minor pieces, okay? So it's possible to castle by moving only one pawn, which is either the e pawn or the g pawn, so that your king's bishop can get out, so that your knight can get out, and you can castle. Okay, 2 pawn moves in the first two moves, not ideal. Bishop comes out, another pawn move. Right, this tells you pretty much all you need to know. Okay, I'm coming up with attacking ideas. My opponent is already trying to defend himself. Okay. So get those minor pieces out into the board, control the game, make it difficult for your opponent, and doing that makes life easy for you. And guys, that is how you win a chess game, right? This guy's rated almost 1250, no chump, okay? Clearly knows how to play chess, but you can beat players who are rated around this level and higher by following the basic principles of chess. But most of all, you've got to take your time. Take your time so that you can scan the whole board, understand what's changed with the last move, come up with some candidate move ideas. Give yourself that time just to consider your options. Right? Don't blindly play the first thing that comes into your head. All right? You will get better. Okay? Thanks for listening. Thanks for making it to the end. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you found it valuable. And I'll see you in the next video.